Jean-Luc Godard was a French-Swiss film director, screenwriter, and film critic. He rose to prominence as a pioneer of the French New Wave film movement of the 1960s, alongside such filmmakers as François Truffaut, Agnès Varda, Éric Rohmer, and Jacques Demy. He was arguably the most influential French filmmaker of the post-war era. According to AllMovie, his work revolutionized the motion picture form through its experimentation with narrative, continuity, sound, and camera work. His most acclaimed films include Breathless, Vivre sa vie, Contempt, Band of Outsiders, Alphaville, Pierrot le Fou, Masculine Feminine, Weekend, and Goodbye to Language. During his early career as a film critic for the influential magazine Cahiers du Cinéma, Godard criticized mainstream French cinema's tradition of quality, which de-emphasized innovation and experimentation. In response, he and like-minded critics began to make their own films, challenging the conventions of traditional Hollywood in addition to French cinema. Godard first received global acclaim for his 1960 feature Breathless, helping to establish the New Wave movement. His work makes use of frequent homages and references to film history, and often expressed his political views. He was an avid reader of existentialism and Marxist philosophy, and in 1969 formed the Gigi Vertov group with other radical filmmakers to promote political works. After the New Wave, his politics were less radical and his later films are about human conflict and artistic representation from a humanist rather than Marxist perspective. Godard was married 3 times, to actresses Anna Karina and Anne Wiazemsky, both of whom starred in several of his films, and later to his longtime partner Anne-Marie Mevely. His collaborations with Karina, which included such critically acclaimed films as Vivre sa vie, Bande à part, and Pierrot le Fou, were called arguably the most influential body of work in the history of cinema by Filmmaker magazine. In a 2002 Sight and Sound poll, Godard ranked 3rd in the critics' top 10 directors of all time. He is said to have generated one of the largest bodies of critical analysis of any filmmaker since the mid-20th century. His work has been central to narrative theory and has challenged both commercial narrative cinema norms and film criticism's vocabulary. In 2010, Godard was awarded an Academy Honorary Award. Early life. Jean-Luc Godard was born on December 3, 1930 in the 7th arrondissement of Paris, the son of Odile and Paul Godard, a Swiss physician. His wealthy parents came from Protestant families of Franco-Swiss descent, and his mother was the daughter of Julien Monod, a founder of the Banque Paribas. She was the great-granddaughter of theologian Adolphe Monod. Other relatives on his mother's side include composer Jacques-Louis Monod, naturalist Théodore Monod, pastor Frédéric Monod, and former Prime Minister and later President of Peru Pedro Pablo Kuczynski. 4 years after Jean-Luc's birth, his father moved the family to Switzerland. At the outbreak of the Second World War, Godard was in France, and returned to Switzerland with difficulty. He spent most of the war in Switzerland, although his family made clandestine trips to his grandfather's estate on the French side of Lake Geneva. Godard attended school in Nyon, Switzerland. Not a frequent cinema-goer, he attributed his introduction to cinema to a reading of André Malraux's essay Outline of a Psychology of Cinema, and his reading of La Revue du Cinéma, which was relaunched in 1946. In 1946, he went to study at the Lycée Buffon in Paris and, through family connections, mixed with members of its cultural elite. He lodged with the writer Jean Schlumberger. Having failed his baccalaureate exam in 1948, he returned to Switzerland. He studied in Lausanne and lived with his parents, whose marriage was breaking up. He spent time in Geneva also with a group that included another film fanatic, Roland Tolmachoff, and the extreme rightist philosopher Jean Parvulesco. His elder sister Rachel encouraged him to paint, which he did, in an abstract style. After time spent at a boarding school in Linen to prepare for the retest, which he passed, he returned to Paris in 1949. He registered for a certificate in anthropology at the University of Paris, but did not attend class. Early career. Film criticism. In Paris, in the Latin Quarter just prior to 1950, cineclubs were gaining prominence. Godard began attending these clubs: the Cinémathèque Française, Ciné-Club du Quartier Latin, Work and Culture Ciné-Club, and others which became his regular haunts. The Cinémathèque was founded by Henri Langlois and Georges Franjou in 1936. Work and Culture was a workers' education group for which André Bazin had organized wartime film screenings and discussions, and which had become a model for the film clubs that had risen throughout France after the liberation. CCQL, founded in about 1947 or 1948, was animated and intellectually led by Maurice Screur. At these clubs he met fellow film enthusiasts including Jacques Rivette, Claude Chabrol, and François Truffaut. Godard was part of a generation for whom cinema took on a special importance. He said, "In the 1950s cinema was as important as bread, but it isn't the case anymore. We thought cinema would assert itself as an instrument of knowledge, a microscope, a telescope. At the Cinémathèque I discovered a world which nobody had spoken to me about. They'd told us about Goethe, but not Dreer. We watched silent films in the era of talkies. We dreamed about film. We were like Christians in the catacombs." His foray into films began in the field of criticism. Along with Maurice Screur and Jacques Rivette, he founded the short-lived film journal La Gazette du Cinéma, which saw the publication of 5 issues in 1950. When Bazin co-founded the influential critical magazine Cahiers du Cinéma in 1951, Godard was the first of the younger critics from the CCQL/Cinémathèque group to be published. The January 1952 issue featured his review of an American melodrama directed by Rudolph Mate, No Sad Songs for Me. His defense and illustration of classical découpage, published in September 1952, in which he attacks an earlier article by Bazin and defends the use of the shot-reverse shot technique, is one of his earliest important contributions to cinema criticism. Praising Otto Preminger and the greatest American artist Howard Hawks, Godard raises their harsh melodramas above the more formalistic and overtly artful films of Wells, De Sica, and Wyler, which Bazin endorsed. At this point Godard's activities did not include making films. Rather, he watched films, and wrote about them, and helped others make films, notably Romer, with whom he worked on Presentation au Charlotte et Son Steak. Filmmaking. Having left Paris in the fall of 1952, Godard returned to Switzerland and went to live with his mother in Lausanne. He became friendly with his mother's lover, Jean-Pierre Laubscher, who was a laborer on the Grande Dixence Dam. Through Laubscher he secured work himself as a construction worker at the Place Fleury work site at the dam. He saw the possibility of making a documentary film about the dam. When his initial contract ended, in order to prolong his time at the dam, he moved to the post of telephone switchboard operator. Whilst on duty, in April 1954, he put through a call to Laubscher which relayed the fact that Odile Monod, Godard's mother, had died in a scooter accident. Thanks to Swiss friends who lent him a 35mm movie camera, he was able to shoot on 35mm film. He rewrote the commentary that Laubscher had written, and gave his film a rhyming title, Operation Betern. The company that administered the dam bought the film and used it for publicity purposes. As he continued to work for Cahiers, he made Une Femme Coquette, a 10-minute short, in Geneva, and in January 1956 he returned to Paris. A plan for a feature film of Goethe's elective affinities proved too ambitious and came to nothing. Truffaut enlisted his help to work on an idea he had for a film based on the true crime story of a petty criminal, Michel Portal, who had shot a motorcycle policeman and whose girlfriend had turned him into the police, but Truffaut failed to interest any producers. Another project with Truffaut, a comedy about a country girl arriving in Paris, was also abandoned. He worked with Romer on a planned series of short films centering on the lives of two young women, Charlotte and Veronique, and in the autumn of 1957, Pierre Braunberger produced the first film in the series, All the Boys Are Called Patrick, directed by Godard from Romer's script. A Story of Water was created largely out of unused footage shot by Truffaut. In 1958, Godard, with a cast that included Jean-Paul Belmondo and Anne Colette, made his last short before gaining international prominence as a filmmaker, Charlotte et son Jules, a homage to Jean Cocteau. The film was shot in Godard's hotel room on the Rue de Rennes and apparently reflected something of the romantic austerity of Godard's own life at this time. His Swiss friend Roland Tolmachoff noted, "In Paris he had a big Bogart poster on the wall and nothing else." In December 1958, Godard reported from the Festival of Short Films in Tours and praised the work of, and became friends with, Jacques Demy, Jacques Roger, and Agnes Varda. He already knew Alain Resnais, whose entry he praised, but Godard now wanted to make a feature film. He traveled to the 1959 Cannes Film Festival and asked Truffaut to let him use the story on which they had collaborated in 1956, about car thief Michel Portal. He sought money from producer Georges de Beauregard, whom he had met previously whilst working briefly in the publicity department of 20th Century Fox's Paris office, and who was also at the festival. Beauregard could offer his expertise, but was in debt from two productions based on Pierre Lodi's stories, hence, financing came instead from a film distributor, René Pignières. New Wave period. Godard's most celebrated period as a director spans roughly from his first feature, Breathless, through to Weekend. His work during this period focused on relatively conventional films that often refer to different aspects of film history. Although Godard's work during this time is considered groundbreaking in its own right, the period stands in contrast to that which immediately followed it, during which Godard ideologically denounced much of cinema's history as bourgeois and therefore without merit. Films: I Breathless/I. None. Early work with Anna Karina. I My Life to Life/I. None. I The Little Soldier/I and I Les Carabiniers/I. None. I Contempt/I. None. Anushka Films. I Weekend/I. None. Politics. Godard was known for his highly political voice, and regularly featured political content in his films. One of his earliest features, Le Petit Soldat, which dealt with the Algerian War of Independence, was notable for its attempt to present the complexity of the dispute. The film was perceived as equivocating and as drawing a moral equivalence between the French forces and the National Liberation Front. Along these lines, Les Carabiniers presents a fictional war that is initially romanticized in the way its characters approach their service, but becomes a stiff anti-war metonym. In addition to the international conflicts to which Godard sought an artistic response, he was also very concerned with the social problems in France. The earliest and best example of this is Karina's potent portrayal of a prostitute in Vivre sa vie. In 1960s Paris, the political milieu was not overwhelmed by one specific movement. There was, however, a distinct post-war climate shaped by various international conflicts such as colonialism in North Africa and Southeast Asia. Godard's Marxist disposition did not become abundantly explicit until La Chinoise and Weekend, but is evident in several films, namely Pierrot and Une Femme Marie. Godard was accused by some of harboring anti-Semitic views. In 2010, in the lead-up to the presentation of Godard's honorary Oscar, a prominent article in the New York Times by Michael Cieply drew attention to the idea, which had been circulating through the press in previous weeks, that Godard might be an anti-Semite, and thus undeserving of the accolade. Siapley makes reference to Richard Brody's book Everything is Cinema, The Working Life of Jean-Luc Godard, and alluded to a previous, longer article published by the Jewish Journal as lying near the origin of the debate. The article also draws upon Brody's book, for example in the following quotation, which Godard made on television in 1981, "Moses is my principal enemy. Moses, when he received the commandments, he saw images and translated them. Then he brought the texts, he didn't show what he had seen. That's why the Jewish people are accursed." Immediately after Siapley's article was published, Brody made a clear point of criticizing the extremely selective and narrow use of passages in his book, and noted that Godard's work approached the Holocaust with the greatest moral seriousness. Indeed, his documentaries feature images from the Holocaust in a context suggesting he considers Nazism and the Holocaust as the nadir of human history. Godard's views become more complex regarding the state of Israel. In 1970, Godard traveled to the Middle East to make a pro-Palestinian film he didn't complete and whose footage eventually became part of the 1976 film Iciet Ehlers. In this film, Godard seems to view the Palestinians' cause as one of many worldwide leftist revolutionary movements. Elsewhere, Godard explicitly identified himself as an anti-Zionist but denied the accusations of anti-Semitism. Vietnam War. Bertolt Brecht. Godard's engagement with German poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht stems primarily from his attempt to transpose Brecht's theory of epic theatre and its prospect of alienating the viewer through a radical separation of the elements of the medium. Brecht's influence is keenly felt through much of Godard's work, particularly before 1980, when Godard used cinematic expression for specific political ends. For example, breathless elliptical editing, which denies the viewer a fluid narrative typical of mainstream cinema, forces the viewers to take on more critical roles, connecting the pieces themselves and coming away with more investment in the work's content. In many of his most political pieces, specifically Weekend, Pierrot le Fou, and La Chinoise, characters address the audience with thoughts, feelings, and instructions. Marxism. A Marxist reading is possible with most if not all of Godard's early work. Godard's direct interaction with Marxism does not become explicitly apparent, however, until Weekend, where the name Karl Marx is cited in conjunction with figures such as Jesus Christ. A constant refrain throughout Godard's cinematic period is that of the bourgeoisie's consumerism, the commodification of daily life and activity, and man's alienation, all central features of Marx's critique of capitalism. In an essay on Godard, philosopher and aesthetics scholar Jacques Rancière states, when in Pierrot le Fou, 1965, a film without a clear political message, Belmondo played on the word scandal and the freedom that the scandal girdle supposedly offered women, the context of a Marxist critique of commodification, of pop art derision at consumerism, and of a feminist denunciation of women's false liberation, was enough to foster a dialectical reading of the joke and the whole story. The way Godard treated politics in his cinematic period was in the context of a joke, a piece of art, or a relationship, presented to be used as tools of reference, romanticizing the Marxist rhetoric, rather than being solely tools of education. Un Femme Marie is also structured around Marx's concept of commodity fetishism. Godard once said that it is a film in which individuals are considered as things, in which chases in a taxi alternate with ethological interviews, in which the spectacle of life is intermingled with its analysis. He was very conscious of the way he wished to portray the human being. His efforts are overtly characteristic of Marx, who in his economic and philosophical manuscripts of 1844 gives one of his most nuanced elaborations, analyzing how the worker is alienated from his product, the object of his productive activity. Georges Seydoux, in his short rumination on the film, describes it as a sociological study of the alienation of the modern woman. Revolutionary period. The period, which spans from May 1968 into the 1970s, has been given various labels, from his militant period to his radical period, along with terms as specific as Maoist and as vague as political. In any case, the period saw Godard employ consistent revolutionary rhetoric in his films and in his public statements. Inspired by the May 68 upheaval, Godard, alongside François Truffaut, led protests that shut down the 1968 Cannes Film Festival in solidarity with the students and workers. Godard stated there was not a single film showing at the festival that represented their causes. Not one, whether by Milos, myself, Polanski or François. There are none. We're behind the times. Films. Sony Mage. Jean-Pierre Gorin. After the events of May 1968, when the city of Paris saw a total upheaval in response to the authoritarian de Gaulle, and Godard's professional objective was reconsidered, he began to collaborate with like-minded individuals in the filmmaking arena. His most notable collaborator was Jean-Pierre Gorin, a Maoist student of Louis Althusser, Michel Foucault, and Jacques Lacan, with a passion for cinema that attracted Godard's attention. Between 1968 and 1973, Godard and Gorin collaborated to make a total of 5 films with strong Maoist messages. The most prominent film from the collaboration was Tout va bien. The film starred Jane Fonda, who was, at the time, the wife of French filmmaker Roger Vadim. Fonda was at the height of her acting career, having won an Academy Award for her performance in Clout, and has gained notoriety as a left-wing anti-war activist. The male lead was the legendary French singer and actor Yves Montand, who had appeared in prestigious films by Georges Clouzot, Alain Resnais, Sacha Guitry, Vincente Minnelli, George Cukor, and Costa Gavras. Zhizhia Vertov Group. The small group of Maoists that Godard had brought together, which included Gorin, adopted the name Zhizhia Vertov Group. Godard had a specific interest in Zhizhia Vertov, a Soviet filmmaker who was known for a series of radical documentaries titled Kino Pravda and the late silent-era feature film Man with a Movie Camera. Vertov was also a contemporary of both Soviet montage theorists, notably Sergei Eisenstein, and Russian constructivist and avant-garde artists such as Alexander Rodchenko and Vladimir Tatlin. Part of Godard's political shift after May 1968 was toward a proactive participation in the class struggle, and he drew inspiration from filmmakers associated with the Russian Revolution. Towards the end of this period of his life, Godard began to feel disappointed with his Maoist ideals and was abandoned by his wife at the time, Anouilh Zemsky. In this context, according to biographer Antoine de Beek, Godard attempted suicide on 2 occasions. Returned to commercial films and I Histoire du cinéma / 1980-2000. None. Late period films, 2001-2022. In 2001, Éloge de l'amour was released. The film is notable for its use of both film and video, the first half captured in 35mm black and white, the latter half shot in color on DV and subsequently transferred to film for editing. The film is also noted for containing themes of aging, love, separation, and rediscovery as it follows the young artist Edgar in his contemplation of a new work on the 4 stages of love. In Notre Musique, Godard turned his focus to war, specifically, the war in Sarajevo, but with attention to all war, including the American Civil War, the war between the U.S. and Native Americans, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The film is structured into 3 Dantean kingdoms: Hell, Purgatory, and Paradise. Godard's fascination with paradox is constant in the film. It opens with a long, ponderous montage of war images that occasionally lapses into the comic. Paradise is shown as a lush wooded beach patrolled by U.S. Marines. Godard's film Socialisme premiered in the Uncertain Regard section at the 2010 Cannes Film Festival. It was released theatrically in France in May 2010. Godard was rumored to be considering directing a film adaptation of Daniel Mendelssohn's The Lost, A Search for 6 of 6 Million, an award-winning book about the Holocaust. In 2013, Godard released the short Les Trois Disasters as part of the omnibus film 3x3D with filmmakers Peter Greenaway and Edgar Pera. 3x3D premiered at the 2013 Cannes Film Festival. His 2014 film Goodbye to Language, shot in 3D, revolves around a couple who cannot communicate with each other until their pet dog acts as an interpreter for them. The film makes reference to a wide range of influences such as paintings by Nicholas de Stael and the writing of William Faulkner, as well as the work of mathematician Laurent Schwartz and dramatist Bertolt Brecht, one of Godard's most important influences. It was selected to compete for the Palme d'Or in the main competition section at the 2014 Cannes Film Festival, where it won the jury prize. Godard's non-traditional script for the film was described as a collage of handwritten text and images, an artwork itself. In 2015, J. Hoberman reported that Godard was working on a new film. Initially titled Tentative de Bleu, in December 2016 Wild Bunch CO chief Vincent Merivale stated that Godard had been shooting Le Livre d'Image for almost 2 years in various Arab countries, including Tunisia, and that it is an examination of the modern Arab world. Le Livre d'Image was first shown in November 2018. On December 4, 2019, an art installation piece created by Godard opened at the Fondazione Prada in Milan. Titled Le Studio di Orfi, the installation is a recreated workspace and includes editing equipment, furniture, and other materials used by Godard in post-production. In 2020, Godard told Les Inrocuptibles that his new film would be about a yellow vest protester, and indicated that along with archival footage there will also be a shoot. "I don't know if I will find what are called actors. I would like to film the people we see on news channels, but by plunging them into a situation where documentary and fiction come together." In March 2021 he said that he was working on 2 new films during a virtual interview at the International Film Festival of Kerala. Godard stated, "I'm finishing my movie life, yes, my movie maker life, by doing 2 scripts. After, I will say, goodbye, cinema." In July 2021, cinematographer and longtime collaborator Fabrice Arignaud said that work on the films was going slowly and Godard was more focused on books, on the ideas of the film, and less in the making. Godard suggested making a film like Chris Marker's La Jetée in order to come back to his origin. Much of the film would be shot on 35mm, 16mm, and 8mm film, but the expense of celluloid film stock and the COVID-19 pandemic stalled production. Arignaud expected to shoot test footage that fall. He added that the second film was for the Arte channel in France. Arignaud said that he didn't think that either film would be Godard's last film, adding, "I say this often, that Éloge de l'amour was the beginning of his last gesture." These 5, or 6, or 7 films are connected to each other in a way. They're not just full stops. It's not just one painting. Legacy. Godard has been recognized as one of the most influential filmmakers of the 20th century and one of the leaders of the French New Wave. In 1969, film critic Roger Ebert wrote about Godard's importance in cinema. Godard is a director of the very first rank. No other director in the 1960s has had more influence on the development of the feature-length film. Like Joyce in fiction or Beckett in theatre, he is a pioneer whose present work is not acceptable to present audiences. But his influence on other directors is gradually creating and educating an audience that will, perhaps in the next generation, be able to look back at his films and see that this is where their cinema began. Filmmaker Quentin Tarantino named a production company he founded A Band Apart, a reference to Godard's 1964 film. Italian director Bernardo Bertolucci included a homage to Band of Outsiders in his film The Dreamers. Godard's works and innovations were praised by notable directors such as Michelangelo Antonioni, Satyajit Ray, and Orson Welles. Fritz Lang agreed to take part in Godard's film Les Mépris due to his admiration of Godard as a director. Akira Kurosawa listed Breathless as one of his 100 favorite films. Political activist, critic, and filmmaker Tariq Ali listed Godard's film Tout va bien as one of his 10 favorite films of all time in the 2012 Sight and Sound Critics poll. American film critic Armand White listed Godard's film Nouvelle Vague as one of his top 10 favorite films in the same poll. Godard's films have influenced and inspired many directors, including Martin Scorsese, Quentin Tarantino, Francis Ford Coppola, George Lucas, David Lynch, David Cronenberg, Peter Bogdanovich, Brian De Palma, Oliver Stone, William Friedkin, Steven Soderbergh, Andrei Tarkovsky, Andrei Konchalovsky, Alejandro Jodorowsky, Abbas Kiarostami, Lars von Trier, Adam Egoyan, D.A. Penny Baker, Claire Denis, Robert Altman, Jim Jarmusch, Takeshi Kitano, Gaspar Noé, John Waters, Mamoru Oshii, Shane Carruth, Stan Brackhag, Ken Loach, Kevin MacDonald, Abel Ferrara, Luca Guadagnino, Terence Davies, Paul Schrader, Rainer Werner Fassbinder, Wong Kar-wai, Edward Yang, Ho Xiaojian, Wim Wenders, Chantal Ackerman, Bella Tarr, Theo Angelopoulos, Raoul Peck, Glauber Rocha, Fernando Solanas, Octavio Getano, Amir Kusturica, Terrence Malick, Paul Thomas Anderson, Wes Anderson, Richard Linklater, Harmony Korine, Darren Aronofsky, Bernardo Bertolucci, Duane Makavjev, Marco Bellocchio, and Pier Paolo Pasolini. 4 of Godard's films are included on the British Film Institute Sight and Sound magazine list of 100 greatest films: Breathless, Les Mépris, Pierrot le Fou, and Histoire du Cinéma. The 60th New York Film Festival, which was held in 2022, paid tribute to Godard, who died earlier that year. Personal life and death. Godard was married to 2 of his leading women, Anna Karina and Anne Wiazemsky. Beginning in 1970, he collaborated personally and professionally with Anne-Marie Mevely. Godard lived with Mevely in Rolle, Switzerland, from 1978 onwards, and was described by his former wife Karina as a recluse. Godard married Mevely in the 2010s, according to Patrick Jeanneret, an advisor to Godard. His relationship with Karina in particular produced some of his most critically acclaimed films, and their relationship was widely publicized. The Independent described them as one of the most celebrated pairings of the 1960s. Filmmaker magazine called their collaborations arguably the most influential body of work in the history of cinema. Late in life, however, Karina said they no longer spoke to each other. Through his father, he was the cousin of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, former president of Peru. In 2017, Michelle Hazanavicius directed a film about Godard, Redoubtable, based on the memoir 1 Year After by Wiazemsky. It centers on his life in the late 1960s, when he and Wiazemsky made films together. The film premiered at the Cannes Film Festival in 2017. Godard said that the film was a stupid idea. Agnes Varda's 2017 documentary Faces Places culminates with Varda and CO director J.R. knocking on Godard's front door in Rolle for an interview. Godard agreed to the meeting, but he stands them up. His nephew and assistant Paul Grivis directed the 2018 documentary film Catastrophe, which included behind-the-scenes footage, shot on the Costa Concordia cruise ship by Grivis during the making of film Socialism, of Godard working with actors and directing the film. Godard participated in the 2022 documentary See You Friday, Robinson. Director Mitra Farahani initiated an email exchange between Godard and Iranian filmmaker Ebrahim Golston, with emailed text letters from Golston and videos, images, and aphorism responses from Godard. At the age of 91, Godard died on September 13, 2022, at his home in Rolle. His death was reported as an assisted suicide procedure, which is legal in Switzerland. Godard's legal advisor said that he had multiple disabling pathologies, but a family member said that he was not sick, he was simply exhausted. Mevely was at his side when he died. His body was cremated and there was no funeral service. Selected filmography. Feature films. The list excludes multi-director anthology films to which Godard has contributed shorts. Collaboration with ECM Records. Godard had a lasting friendship with Manfred Eicher, founder and head of the German music label ECM Records. The label released the soundtracks of Godard's Nouvelle Vague and Histoire du Cinéma. This collaboration expanded over the years, leading to Godard's granting ECM permission to use stills from his films for album covers, while Eicher took over the musical direction of Godard films such as Allemagne 1990, Hélas pour moi, JLG, and Forever Mozart. Tracks from ECM Records have been used in his films, for example, the soundtrack for In Praise of Love uses Ketil Bjernstad and David Darling's album epigraphs extensively. Godard also released on the label a collection of shorts he made with Anne-Marie Mevely called 4 Short Films. Among the ECM album covers with Godard's film stills are these. Voci, works of Luciano Berio played by Kim Kashkashian. Words of the Angel, by Trio Medieval. Morimer, by Christoph Poppen and the Hilliard Ensemble. Songs of Debussy and Mozart, by Julianne Bance and Andras Schiff. Requiem for Larissa, by Valentin Silvestrov. Soul of Things, by Tomasz Stanko Quartet. Suspended Night, by Tomasz Stanko Quartet. Asturiana, Songs from Spain and Argentina, by Kim Kashkashian and Robert Levin. Distances, by Norma Winstone, Glauco Venier and Klaus Gessing. Live at Birdland, by Lee Konitz, Brad Meldaw, Charlie Hayden and Paul Motion.